In this lesson, we're going to move to southern Italy. Southern Italy is full-on Mediterranean. The end of the Italian peninsula is surrounded by water on three sides. The climate is so hot that agriculture is incredibly abundant, and we see all kinds of produce available to us. Likewise, the fishing is rich. We're going to begin with making a dish called caponata. It's an eggplant relish, and I'm going to get it started here, and then we can talk a little bit more. I've got a pan that's hot, and in there I'm going to add olive oil and some onions, and we'll give those a chance to cook. One of the great things about southern Italy, one of the really distinguishing features, is that the Italian peninsula sticks down into the center of the Mediterranean almost, and anyone who travels through that area is bound to land in southern Italy at some point. So ideas from other parts of the Mediterranean make their way to southern Italy and are adopted. As an example, in Sicily, it's not uncommon to see couscous, which made its way from North Africa, or almond confections, or oranges, which made their way from the Far East all the way to the Mediterranean, are very popular in southern Italy. This particular dish, caponata, has an incredibly distinctive sweet-sour flavor profile, and in Africa, they have a fondness for adding sweetness to their savory food. And so this is really an expression of that flavor profile. The other thing that's distinctive about southern Italy is that because it sticks so far out into the Mediterranean, it's just a quick hop, skip, and a jump across to Africa. The Mediterranean narrows to about 60 miles at that point, and at early summer, it's not uncommon for the tuna to leave the Atlantic, come into the warm waters of the Mediterranean to spawn. And in that locale, right between southern Italy and northern Africa, a tremendous amount of tuna fishing is done there. So tuna is a staple almost in that part of the world, and we're going to cook some tuna here today. All right, these onions are just about translucent, and I'm going to add some celery. But for me, it's kind of important that the celery in this dish should stay a little bit crisp. So don't put it in at the same time as the onions, but actually a little bit later on. This caponata, this eggplant relish, features eggplant, and I've got some here. Oftentimes you'll see it sautéed in oil and then taken out before the rest of the relish is made. I oftentimes like to dress it with a little bit of oil and then roast it in a hot oven. My experience has been that eggplant loves to absorb oil, and when you saute it, sometimes this dish can get a little bit heavy. And so baking it in the oven is a nice idea. I usually dice it up, and I like to leave the skin on for two reasons. One, I love the way it looks, and two, the pieces of eggplant seem to hold together a little bit better if you leave the skin in place. Okay, next I'm going to add all of these ingredients, and I'll just sort of run them by you very quickly. Here's capers, and I'm going to add capers to this pan. Here, to underscore that sweet-sour flavor, is some golden raisins. And those make their way in as well. And then I've got some olives. This is a nice blend of green and black olives to lend some saltiness to this. And then finally some pine nuts that have been toasted. And they'll give us a little crunch and some richness. And I'm going to stew that all in a little bit of pureed tomato. Let me turn the heat down just a hair. And then while it's simmering, the eggplant can go in and it will absorb all of the flavors that are already in that pan. As I said, eggplants are like little sponges. and they drink up flavor. Because the eggplant was already cooked, this is just about where I want it to be, but there's some seasoning that needs to be done still. Certainly it needs to be seasoned with salt. And I'm going to add some red wine vinegar to cut through the richness of the sautéed vegetables. And then here's where it gets really distinctive. I'm going to add some sugar. And you're looking for a nice balance between the acid of the red wine vinegar, the sweetness of the sugar, and the saltiness that you will find inherent in the capers. Don't let it cook so long that the celery is no longer a little bit al dente, a little bit crunchy. Let's see how it tastes. I would say be bold. This is a bold dish. So as long as you get the balance of those basic tastes, I think you're on the right track. All right, I want to pull this off the heat and let it cool for a little bit. And let's talk tuna. I've got a beautiful block of tuna right here. And what I want to do, it's a little bit large, so I'm going to cut it right down the middle. And we'll just cook one of these. And I want to sear it. So I've got a pan that's getting hot. It's pretty hot already, I think. I want to sear it so that I get some color on the outside without overcooking the tuna on the inside. And my fear is always this, that when I put this tuna with spices on the outside into the pan, those spices will burn before I can get it out of the pan. So I'm not going to put spices on until later on. All I'm going to put on is a little bit of salt. And I'll put it on all four sides. And then we'll take this hot pan all the way up, and we'll introduce a little bit of oil, and then the fish can go in. Now the pan should be hot enough that that oil will begin to smoke almost immediately. And so lay this in and lay it away from yourself so you don't splash hot oil on yourself. Okay, while this is cooking on the first side, I'm going to take a piece of plastic wrap and just lay it here on my cutting board. Now the spices that I'm interested in having on this piece of tuna include black pepper. So I'm going to put some black pepper here, and then some crushed fennel seed. And I'll put crushed fennel seed on there as well. Now I can monitor the progress here. Already I can turn this to a new side because I want to keep it pretty rare. That's my preferred degree of doneness for tuna. So we'll cook it on the second side for a like amount of time. And you can monitor the progress of the tuna right at the end. And I'm going to turn it again. Turn the heat down just a little bit. And this is taking, what, 20, 30 seconds aside. And it's important to me that I get some browning on the tuna. That browning is really where the flavor development in this dish takes place. All right, let's turn it to its last side and give it some browning. Obviously, if you've got a hood, you should have that on in your kitchen. I'm going to go ahead and turn this pan off now because the residual heat will carry over into this piece of tuna. All right, 4 nicely browned sides. Now, I'm going to take this out of the pan, and If you look at the end, you can see that it is basically rare in the interior. And I'm going to put it right onto this saran, and we'll roll it back and forth once or twice and try and get these spices right onto the meat. If there's any areas that you think could use a little bit more, by all means, add some. And then, just so that those spices can stick in place, I'm just going to wrap it real briefly in this plastic wrap and just let it sit and cool. It won't take very long to cool. It wasn't cooked any further than rare, so it doesn't have a tremendous amount of heat in it. My favorite part of this preparation is taking this plastic wrap off and getting a big snootful of all of those spices as they've become more volatile and aromatic. I can already smell the fennel coming off of this piece of tuna. I'm going to cut the ends off, and then let's open it up. And we're good to go. All right. With a very sharp knife, let's cut this into slices. It tastes great. Now, certainly, if you like your tuna cooked a little bit more than this, far be it for me to tell you that this is the only way you should prepare it. But be a little adventurous. If you usually eat tuna well done, try it medium and see how you like that. A really good quality piece of fish like this, I think, benefits from being cooked a little bit less. The interior of this tuna hasn't seen salt yet, so I'm going to put just a little sprinkle of salt right down the top. And then we've got the caponata, and it's had a chance to cool. I'm going to spoon some onto the plate here. And I think a little bit of chopped parsley is not a bad idea. And there you have it. Seared tuna with fennel seed, caponata. And if you like the idea of caponata, you might choose to put a little bit on the side and a glass of wine. And this is a great way to start a meal and taste exactly what it's like to be in the southern part of Italy. Specifically, I would say this is Sicilian. The heart and soul of a good pizza, I think, is the dough, and so let's start there. I have the ingredients all laid out here, and they're fairly simple. Flour, yeast, salt, water, and a little bit of olive oil. And as ingredients in a recipe become simpler and simpler, understanding those ingredients and the technique for mixing them becomes more important. So let's start with the yeast. I have some yeast right here. It's about a packet of yeast, a little bit, right around 2 teaspoons. And I'm going to take some warm water, about 100 and 110 degrees, and I'm going to add that warm water right to the yeast. Some people say they like to add sugar so the yeast has something to eat. I oftentimes will add a little bit of flour. The reality is that sugar is not a food that yeast can eat. It can't eat sucrose, but what it can do through enzyme activity is break down that sugar into simpler sugars that it can eat. But it can do the same thing with flour as well. So I have this, and I would set it aside and let it rise for a while, about 10 minutes, and it'll become kind of foamy. Here I've got some yeast that has been sitting now for a good deal of time, and you can see it's just starting to rise up to the surface, and when I smell it, it is a little bit foamy already. So what has happened is the yeast has proven to me that it's still alive, and they call this proofing. The thing that you should realize or know is that when you go to the supermarket and buy yeast today in the little packages, much of it is called instant yeast, and it doesn't need to be proofed. You can just add it to your doughs without going through this added step. But I think it's a good idea, if you're not using yeast all the time, to proof it so that you know that you're not going to be wasting your time later on. Anyhow, I'm going to take this and add it to the flour. Now, the flour is all-purpose flour. Every flour has a certain amount of protein in it, what's known as gluten, and gluten is unique in that when you add liquid to it and you manipulate it, it becomes elastic. That's what makes all of the baked goods we enjoy possible. The cakes, the cookies, so on and so forth. A flour that has a lot of gluten is called a strong flour, and it can hold its shape in a large loaf. But we're making pizza, very, very shallow, and so a flour like all-purpose, one that can be used for pastries as well as breads, is probably fine. It's got about 7 to 9% protein. So in goes the yeast to the flour, and I want to make sure that I don't leave any yeast behind. Now, one thing I don't want you to do is ever take salt and put it right in the water with the yeast. Salt and yeast don't like one another. Think of salt almost like a disciplinarian for yeast, or a parent. Don't eat that, don't play so hard, time to go to bed. What you want to do is wait until the yeast is already mixed into the dough before you add the salt. Likewise, don't add the oil yet either, because the oil will encapsulate the yeast and it won't be able to eat the food. It won't be able to eat the flour and turn it into simpler starches that it can digest and turn into carbon dioxide, which will then make your dough rise. Anyhow, let's get started mixing this. Let me just give this a quick stir. That looks a little better. So now that the dough has begun to mix, I feel comfortable adding salt. About a teaspoon of salt I'm going to add in here. And as it's mixing later on, we can add the oil as well, about 2 tablespoons of oil. So this dough is about halfway mixed right now. When you measure flour and water in a cup, you have to recognize that that is variable at best. I can take flour and pack it into a cup and it may weigh as much as 4.5 ounces, but if I sift it very light and I put it into a cup, it might weigh only 3 3/4 ounces. Bakers understand this very, very well, and so they always weigh their flour. But for the home cook, that's not often practical. You don't have a scale probably in your kitchen. What you should, however, do is make a point of going in and feeling the dough. It's important that you have an understanding of it having the right amount of liquid or the right amount of flour. So I'm going to pull this out for just a second. And you can see the dough is here. It's a little bit sticky, but not so sticky that it flows. This feels just about right. I think the dough should be moist. And so if it's moist but it clears the bowl, so much the better. You can always add a little bit of moisture or a little bit more flour, but halfway through the mixing you should stop and pay attention to that. I'm going to mix it the rest of the way, and I'm going to add a couple of tablespoons of oil to this dough as well. All right, this dough has mixed now for about 8 minutes, and what I want to do is take it out of the bowl and put it onto the counter so that we can have a closer look at it. I'm going to put a little bit of flour down. And we'll scrape the dough together. And I want to knead it just a little bit. If it's sticky like this, it's not the end of the world. I think a moist dough is far preferable than a dough that is too dry. So a little bit of flour can help you knead this. You want to knead this until the dough becomes resilient, until it becomes elastic, and until it becomes smooth. And this is pretty much there. The mixer did the heavy lifting for us. But I want to do a little bit by hand just so you can see the process. You fold it over on itself and then roll it forward. And you carry on like that. Add a little flour as you need, but not so much that it goes everywhere. And one way of telling that the dough is fully developed, fully kneaded, is to take a little bit of the dough and begin to stretch it. Stretch it thinner and thinner and thinner, and it should actually get thin enough to be translucent before it tears. So this is not quite developed enough, but it's very close. Maybe another minute's worth of kneading, and we are there. Once this dough is fully developed, smooth, resilient, then I'm going to take and put it in an oiled bowl and keep it in a warm spot, and in about an hour and a half it will double in size. That's because the yeast is giving off carbon dioxide and it's being trapped in the elastic matrix of this dough, the gluten in this dough. All right, so I'm happy with this dough. I'm going to get a bowl. We'll put the last tablespoon of oil in here, and I'll put it in and coat it. We'll cover this with saran, and it can be set aside in a warm spot to rise. In about an hour and a half, as I said, it will have doubled in size. And here's one that's already done that. At this point, the yeast has eaten the food that's close by. It's given off carbon dioxide. The dough is relaxed. It's risen. And now I need to redistribute the yeast. So I'm going to punch down through the middle and then fold the edges over on top of the dough. In effect, I'm going to redistribute the yeast so that the yeast can have more food to eat. This dough now is ready to be used. I could divide this into 4, and it would be appropriate for about 4 individual pizzas. And I've done that here already, you can see. I've divided it into 4, I rounded those pieces, and then I set them aside to let them rise again. They need to sit for 20 minutes or a half an hour after you've shaped them like this so that they can relax and rise. But this dough right here, because it holds an indentation when I give it a poke, is just about ready to make pizza. So our dough is ready to go. Now, I should have mentioned, you can go oftentimes to the freezer section of your supermarket and find pizza dough there ready to be taken home, slacked out overnight in the refrigerator and used the following day. But I think it's fun to make it by yourself. So let's grab a piece of this dough. And from this point forward, I want to be a little careful not to knock too much air out of it. And we're going to start the process of shaping a pizza. First thing I want to do is press my fingers around the edge like this and create what will become the crust. That's sort of a crown right now that I've created by pressing all the way around the edge. And then I'm going to press the insides a little bit thin and pick it up and begin to stretch that dough. Now, you can feel where it's thick, and when you do, that's the place you want to give a little bit extra attention to. Keep working it around like this. You don't have to pick it up unless you want to, but feel for those thick spots, because that's what you need to attend to. If your dough rips, and let me just make a little rip in this so that you can see. If your dough rips, it's not the end of the world because it's a pretty easy thing to stick it back together again. You might even consider stretching it over the back of your hands like this. So I turned it over, but stretch it over the back of your hands like that. And little by little, your pizza shell will get rounder and bigger. This is an individual pizza size. So I'm expecting that this will be probably around 10 inches, 9, 10 inches, something like that. And I think we're just about there now. So I'm going to transfer it over to the back of a pan, but not before I put some flour on here, because I want this dough to slide easily off this pan. And you can see right now it slides. From this point forward, we probably want to work pretty quickly. I've got a nice tomato sauce here, and I want to spread it up to the edge, but not covering the crown or the crust. And I'm going to take a couple of basil leaves and just tear those into pieces and sprinkle those over the crust. And, you know, this and mozzarella cheese is really the heart of the simplest pizza, margherita. So come on over, because we've got some cheese, and I want to cut it into slices. I think a fresh mozzarella like this doesn't need to be grated. We'll just cut it into slices. And I'm going to gather those slices up, put them into a bowl, and let's bring them over. We'll add this to our pizza as well. Exercise a little bit of restraint. You know, this shouldn't be so loaded down with ingredients that the pizza just can't bake. All right. And then finally, I'm going to put on some grating cheese as well. This can be Parmesan, this can be Pecorino. I'm choosing Pecorino right here. And I think that's good. A little bit of pepper. Make sure that this still moves around on your pan. And then come on over to the oven. Now, I have the oven turned up as hot as it will go. And I put a pizza stone in that oven, and I've let it heat for almost an hour. I've moved that pizza stone up towards the top of the oven. You can see it right there. And it holds a tremendous amount of heat, but what I might not have enough of is top heat. I've got the heat in the stone, but maybe not enough heat on the top. And so I'm going to switch this over once the pizza's in so that it becomes a broiler. And I'm going to broil the pizza from the top. Now, you've got to keep your eyes on it. You know, you need to be able to switch from broil back to bake. But let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to slide this in. Just so that you know, I'm going to put it onto the stone, make sure that this is loose, and then slide the pan out in one motion. Here we go. All right, so there's our pizza. Now, I know that there's plenty of heat in the stone, but what I'm going to do is turn this broiler on and turn the temperature to broil. And we'll keep our eye on it. In Naples, where they make pizza, and they're justly famous for their pizza, they can bake a pizza in about a minute and a half or 2 minutes. They have a pizza oven that is very, very hot. In a home pizza, or a home oven like this, the temperature maxes out around 500 degrees. Neapolitan pizza ovens, probably 750 or more. The broiler element is glowing. And so I'm getting more top heat, and that'll help me get some browning. Many people, myself included, believe that a pizza crust should not just be golden brown, but it should actually be charred in spots. That's where the real flavor comes from. And so we're going to keep our eye on that. As I said, in Naples, they can bake a pizza in a minute and a half. This has probably been about 6 minutes, something like that. But let's take a look and see where we're at. I'm going to pull the pizza out. A couple of things that I love to see is a little bit of charring on the dough. I like the cheese to brown. If we check the bottom of the crust, it's firm, and I have a little bit of browning on the bottom as well, which is entirely appropriate. So from 1.5 minutes in Naples to about 6 minutes here. But this, I think, is a pretty good setup, and you can play around with it in your own home. And if you could turn out a pizza like that, I can guarantee you you'd be really, really happy with the results. So in the Mediterranean, when the weather turns really hot, a dessert is there not just to give you a little something sweet at the end of the meal, but if it can cool you off, how great would that be? I'm going to show you how to make a frozen dessert, a frozen confection called Granita, and you don't need an ice cream freezer to make it. You can just use the freezer you have at the top of your refrigerator. This is coffee Granita, and it starts by making some really strong coffee. I used a press pot here, and I used twice as much coffee as I would ordinarily use. Other times I will make an espresso or a number of espressos and use espresso, or even instant coffee can be used where you make it really strong. Anyhow, I'm going to put the coffee into a shallow pan like this, and we want to sweeten it. And the sugar plays two very important roles. The first role is all about flavor. This tempers the bitterness of the coffee. But the second role is that the sugar will keep this liquid coffee from freezing solid like an ice cube. The sugar makes it freeze a little bit softer. So we'll just dissolve this sugar, and when the sugar is dissolved, this mixture goes into the freezer. You should probably make it the night before. It takes 2 or 3 hours to freeze good and solid. So if you make it after dinner this night, it'll be ready for dinner the following night. So I'm going to take this and put it in the freezer. So our Granita is frozen right now. You can see it here in the bottom of the pan. All we need to do is shave it into sort of a soft, crumbly, flaky, frozen confection, almost like a slush. So draw the fork over the top just like this, and it will come apart. If you've got a lot to do, you could certainly use the food processor, but this looks just about right for our purposes. And I'm going to take and spoon some into a bowl. And this can go right back into the freezer. It'll last for a week or two without any difficulty. Sooner or later, it'll start to absorb flavors from the freezer, so make sure that you keep it well wrapped. Now, that's where it begins. And I'm going to put just a dollop of sweetened cream on the top. And a little bit of mint. And our Granita is done. So this is a pretty simple meal. We've got here the Caponata that can be made ahead and stored in your refrigerator for a long time. It keeps very, very well. I love this idea of serving it with tuna that's been seared quickly and then rolled in spices. I showed you how to make a pizza by jury-rigging your own oven into a Neapolitan pizza oven, and then finally with something cooling and a little bit of a pick-me-up in the form of strong coffee, this Granita is a dessert that you'll go back to again and again.